The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 6, Side 2. The one element of stability amid these fluctuations was the Bank of St. George. During the war with Venice, the government had borrowed money from its citizens and had given them promissory notes. After the war, it was unable to redeem these pledges, but it turned over to the lenders the customs dues of the port. The creditors organized themselves into the Casa di San Giorgio, the House of St. George, chose a directorate of 8 governors, and received from the state a palace for their use. The house, or company, was well managed, being the least corrupt institution in the Republic. It was entrusted with the collection of taxes. It lent some of its funds to the government, and received in return substantial properties in Liguria, Corsica, the eastern Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. It became both the state treasury and a private bank, accepting deposits, discounting notes, making loans to commerce and industry. As all factions were financially tied to it, all respected it, and left it unharmed in revolution and war. Its magnificent Renaissance palace still stands in the Piazza Caricamento. The fall of Constantinople was almost a fatal blow to Genoa. The rich Genoese settlement at Pera, near Constantinople, was taken over by the Turks. When the impoverished republic once more submitted to France in 1458, Francesco Sforza financed a revolution that expelled the French and made Genoa again a dependency of Milan, this in 1464. The confusion that weakened Milan after the assassination of Galeazzo Maria Sforza in 1476 allowed the Genoese a brief interlude of freedom. But when Louis XII seized Milan in 1499, Genoa too succumbed to his power. At last, in the long conflict between Francis I and Charles V, a Genoese admiral, Andrea Doria, turned his ships against the French, drove them out of Genoa, and established a new republican constitution, this in 1528. Like the governments of Florence and Venice, it was a commercial oligarchy. Only those families were enfranchised whose names were inscribed in Il Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book. The new regime, a Senate of 400, a Council of 200, a Doge elected for 2 years, brought a disciplined peace to the factions and maintained the independence of Genoa till the coming of Napoleon in 1797. Amid this passionate disorder, the city contributed far less than her due share to Italian letters, science, and art. Her captains explored the seas avidly, but when her son Columbus appeared among them, Genoa was too timid or too poor to finance his dream. The nobles were absorbed in politics, the merchants in gain. Neither class spared much for the adventures of the mind. The old cathedral of San Lorenzo was remodeled in Gothic in 1307 with a majestic interior. Its chapel of San Giovanni Battista, from 1451 and on, was adorned with a handsome altar and canopy by Matteo Civitali, and a somber statue of the Baptist by Jacopo Sansovino. Andrea Doria effected almost as significant a revolution in Genoese art as in government. He brought Fra Giovanni di Montorsoli from Florence to remodel the Palazzo Doria in 1529, and Perino del Vaga from Rome to adorn it with frescoes and stucco reliefs, grotesques, and arabesques. The result was one of the most ornate residences in Italy. Leone Leoni, rival and foe of Cellini, came from Rome to cast a fine medallion of the admiral, and Montorsoli designed his tomb. In Genoa, the Renaissance did not long antedate Doria, and did not long survive his death. 3. Pavia. Between Genoa and Milan, the ancient city of Pavia lay quietly along the Ticino. Once it had been the seat of the Lombard kings. Now, in the 14th century, it was subject to Milan, and was used by the Visconti and the Sforzas as a second capital. There, Galeazzo Visconti II began in 1360, and Gian, that is, Giovanni or John, Galeazzo Visconti, completed the majestic castello that served as a ducal residence for its second founder, and as a pleasure palace for later dukes of Milan. Petrarch called it the noblest product of modern art, and many contemporaries ranked it first among the royal dwellings of Europe. The library contained one of the most precious collections of books in Europe, including 951 illuminated manuscripts. Louis XII, having taken Milan in 1499, carried off this Pavia library among his spoils, and a French army destroyed the interior of the castle with the latest artillery in 1527. Nothing remains but the walls. Though the castello is ruined, the finest jewel of the Visconti and the Sforzas survives intact, the Certosa, or Carthusian monastery, hidden off the highway between Pavia and Milan. Here, in a placid plain, Gian Galeazzo Visconti undertook to build cells, cloisters, and a church in fulfillment of a vow made by his wife. From that beginning until 1499, the Dukes of Milan continued to develop and embellish the edifice as the favorite embodiment of their piety and their art. There is nothing more exquisite in Italy. The Lombard Romanesque facade of white Carrara marble was designed, carved, and erected, from 1473 on, by Cristoforo Mantegazza and Giovanni Antonio Amadeo of Pavia, sponsored by Galeazzo Maria Sforza and Ludovico il Moro. It is too ornate, too fondly gifted with arches, statues, reliefs, medallions, columns, pilasters, capitals, arabesques, carved angels, saints, sirens, princes, fruits, and flowers, to convey a sense of unity and harmony. Each part importunes attention regardless of the whole. But each part is a labor of love and skill. The 4 Renaissance windows by Amadeo would of themselves entitle him to the remembrance of mankind. In some Italian churches the facade is a brave front on an otherwise undistinguished exterior. But in this Certosa di Pavia, every external feature and aspect is arrestingly beautiful. The stately attached buttresses, the noble towers, arcades, and spires of the north transept and the apse, the graceful columns and arches of the cloisters. Within the court the eye rises from these slender columns through 3 successive stories of arcades to the 4 superimposed colonnades of the cupola. This is an ensemble harmoniously conceived and admirably wrought. Within the church everything is of unsurpassed excellence. Columns rising in clusters and Gothic arches to carved and coffered vaults, bronze and iron grills as delicately designed as royal lace, doors and archways of elegant form and ornament, altars of marble studded with precious stones, paintings by Perugino, Borgognone, and Luini, the magnificent inlaid choir stalls, the luminous stained glass, the careful carving of pillars, spandrels, archivolts, and cornices, the stately tomb of Gian Galeazzo Visconti by Cristoforo Romano and Benedetto Briosco, and, as the last relic of a pathetic romance, the tomb and figures of Ludovico il Moro and Beatrice d'Este, here united in exquisite marble, though they died 10 years and 500 miles apart. In a like union of diverse moods, the Lombard, Gothic, and Renaissance styles are here wedded in the most nearly perfect architectural product of the Renaissance. For under Ludovico the Moor, Milan had gathered fair women to create an unrivaled court, and supreme artists like Bramante, Leonardo, and Caradosso, to snatch the leadership of Italy for one bright decade from Florence, Venice, and Rome. 4. The Visconti, 1378 to 1447. Galeazzo II, dying in 1378, bequeathed his share of the Milanese realm to his son Gian Galeazzo Visconti, who continued to use Pavia as a capital. Here was a man who would have warmed Machiavelli's heart. Immersed in the great library of his palace, taking care of a delicate constitution, winning his subjects by moderate taxation, attending church with impressive piety, filling his court with priests and monks, he was the last prince in Italy whom diplomats would have suspected of planning to unite the entire peninsula under his rule. Yet this was the ambition that seethed in his brain. He pursued it to the end of his life, and almost realized it, and in its service he used craft, treachery, and murder as if he had studied the unwritten prince with reverence and had never heard of Christ. Meanwhile, his uncle Bernabo was ruling the other half of the Visconti realm from Milan. Bernabo was a candid villain. He taxed his subjects to the edge of endurance, compelled the peasantry to keep and feed the 5,000 hounds that he used in the chase, and stilled resentment by announcing that criminals would be tortured for 40 days. He laughed at Gian Galeazzo's piety and schemed how to dispose of him and make himself master of all the Visconti heritage. Gian, equipped with the spies necessary to any competent government, learned of these plans. He arranged a meeting with Bernabo, who came conveniently with 2 sons. Gian's secret guard arrested all 3 and apparently poisoned Bernabo in 1385. Gian now ruled Milan, Novara, Pavia, Piacenza, Parma, Cremona, and Brescia. In 1387 he took Verona, in 1389 Padua. In 1399 he shocked Florence by buying Pisa for 200,000 florins. In 1400 Perugia, Assisi, and Siena, and in 1401 Lucca and Bologna submitted to his generals. And John was master of nearly all North Italy from Novara to the Adriatic. The Papal States were now weakened by the schism, this from 1378 to 1417, that had followed the return of the papacy from Avignon. John played pope against rival pope, and dreamed of absorbing all the lands of the Church. Then he would send his armies against Naples. His control of Pisa and other outlets would force Florence into submission. Venice alone would remain unbound, but helpless against a united Italy. However, in 1402, John Galeazzo, aged 51, died. All this time he had hardly moved from Pavia or Milan. He liked intrigue better than war, and achieved by subtlety more than his generals won for him by arms. Nor could these political enterprises exhaust the fertility of his mind. He issued a code of laws, including the regulation of public health and the compulsory isolation of infectious disease. He built the Castello of Pavia and began the Certosa di Pavia and the Cathedral of Milan. He called Manuel Chrysoloras to the chair of Greek in the University of Milan, fostered the University of Pavia, helped poets, artists, scholars, and philosophers, and relished their company. He extended the Naviglio Grande, or Great Canal, from Milan to Pavia, thereby opening an inland waterway across the breadth of Italy from the Alps through Milan and the Po to the Adriatic Sea, and providing irrigation for thousands of acres of soil. The agriculture and commerce so promoted encouraged industry. Milan began to rival Florence in woolen goods. Her smiths made weapons and armor for warriors throughout Western Europe. In one crisis, 2 master armorers forged arms for 6,000 soldiers in a few days. In 1314, the silk weavers of Lucca, impoverished by faction and war, had migrated by hundreds to Milan. By 1400, the silk industry was well developed there, and moralists complained that clothing had become shamefully beautiful. John Galeazzo protected this flourishing economy with wise administration, equable justice, and reliable currency, and a tolerable taxation that extended to clergy and nobility as well as laymen and commoners. Under his prodding, the postal service was expanded. In 1425, over 100 horses were regularly employed by the post. Private correspondence was accepted at post offices, and traveled all day, in emergency all night as well. In 1423, Florence had an annual state revenue of 4 million gold florins, or $100 million, Venice 11 million, Milan 12 million. Kings were glad to have their sons and daughters marry into the Visconti family. Emperor Wenceslas merely crowned fact with form when, in 1395, he gave imperial sanction and legitimacy to John's title of duke, and invested him and his heirs with the Duchy of Milan forever. This proved to be 52 years. John's oldest son, John Maria Visconti, was 13 when his father died in 1402. The generals who had led John's victorious armies competed for the regency. While they fought for Milan, Italy resumed her fragmentation. Florence recaptured Pisa, Venice took Verona, Vicenza, and Padua, Siena and Perugia and Bologna submitted to individual despots. Italy was as before, and worse, for John Maria, leaving the government to oppressive regents, devoted himself to his dogs, trained them to eat human flesh, and joyfully watched them feed on the live men whom he had condemned as political offenders or social criminals. In 1412, 3 nobles stabbed him to death. His brother, Filippo Maria Visconti, seemed to have inherited the subtle intelligence, the patient industry, the ambitious and far-seeing policies of his father. But what had been sedentary courage in John Galeazzo became in Filippo sedentary timidity, a perpetual fear of assassination, a haunting belief in universal human perfidy. He shut himself up in the castle of Porta Giovia at Milan, ate and grew fat, cherished superstitions and astrologers, and yet by pure craft remained to the end of his long reign the absolute master of his country, his generals, and even of his family. He married Beatrice Tenda for her money and condemned her to death for infidelity. He married Maria of Savoy, kept her secluded from all but her ladies-in-waiting, brooded over his lack of a son, took a mistress, and became partly human in his affection for the pretty daughter Bianca who was born of this liaison. He continued his father's patronage of learning, called noted scholars to the University of Pavia, and gave commissions to Brunellesco and the incomparable medalist Pisanello. He ruled Milan with efficient autocracy, suppressing faction, maintaining order, protecting peasants against feudal exactions, and merchants against brigandage. By deft diplomacy and adroit manipulation of his armies, he restored to Milanese allegiance Parma and Piacenza, all of Lombardy to Brescia, all the lands between Milan and the Alps. And in 1421 he persuaded the Genoese that his dictatorship was milder than their civil wars. He encouraged marriages between rival families, so ending many feuds. For 100 petty tyrannies he set up one, and the population, shorn of liberty but free from internal strife, grumbled, prospered, and multiplied. He had a flair for finding able generals, suspected them all of wishing to replace him, played them off against one another, and kept war brewing in the hope of regaining all that his father had won and his brother had lost. A breed of powerful condottieri developed in his wars with Venice and Florence. Gattamelata, Colleoni, Carmagnola, Braccio, Fortebraccio, Montone, Piccinino, Muzio Attendolo. Muzio was a country lad, one of a large family of male and female fighters. He won the cognomen Sforza by the strength of his body and will with which he served Queen Joanna II of Naples. He lost her favor and was thrown into prison. His sister, in full armor, forced his jailers to set him free. He was given command of one of the Milanese armies, but was drowned soon afterward while crossing a stream, this in 1424. His bastard son, then 22, leaped into his father's place and fought and married his way to a throne. 5. The Sforzas, 1450 to 1500. Francesco Sforza was the ideal of Renaissance soldiers. Tall, handsome, athletic, brave. The best runner, jumper, wrestler in his army. Sleeping little, marching bareheaded winter and summer, winning the devotion of his men by sharing their hardships and rations, and leading them to lucrative victories by strategy and tactics rather than by superior numbers or arms. So unrivaled was his reputation that enemy forces, on more than one occasion, laid down their arms at sight of him and greeted him with uncovered heads as the greatest general of his time. Ambitious to found a state of his own, he allowed no scruple to hinder his policy. He fought alternatively for Milan, Florence, and Venice, until Filippo won his loyalty by giving him Bianca in marriage, with Cremona and Pontremoli as her dowry, this in 1441. When, 6 years later, Filippo died heirless, bringing the Visconti dynasty to an end, Francesco felt that the dowry should include Milan. The Milanese thought differently, and they proclaimed a republic named Ambrosian, from the masterful bishop who had chastened Theodosius and converted Augustine 1,000 years before. But the rival factions in the city could not agree. The dependencies of Milan snatched the opportunity to declare themselves free. Some of them fell before Venetian arms. Danger was imminent of a Venetian or Florentine attack. Moreover, the Duke of Orleans, the Emperor Frederick III, and King Alfonso of Aragon all claimed Milan as their own. In this crisis, a deputation sought Sforza, gave him Brescia, and begged him to defend Milan. He fought off its enemies with resourceful energy, but when the new government made peace with Venice without consulting him, he turned his troops against the Republic, besieged Milan to the edge of starvation, accepted its surrender, entered the city amid the acclamations of a hungry populace, and dulled the lust for liberty by distributing bread. A general assembly was summoned, composed of one man from each household. It invested him with the ducal authority over the protests of the emperor, and the Sforza dynasty began its brief and brilliant career in 1450. His elevation did not change his character. He continued to live simply and to work hard. Now and then he was cruel or treacherous, alleging the good of the state as his excuse. Generally he was a man of justice and humanity. He suffered from a lawless sensitivity to the beauty of women. His accomplished wife killed his mistress and then forgave him. She bore him 8 children, advised him wisely in politics, and won the people to his rule by succoring the needy and protecting the oppressed. His administration of the state was as competent as his leadership of its armies. The social order that he enforced brought back to the city a prosperity that dimmed the memory of its suffering and its fitful liberty. As a citadel against revolt or siege, he began to build the enormous Castello Sforzesco. He cut new canals through the land, organized public works, and built the Ospedale Maggiore, or Great Hospital. He brought the humanist Filelfo to Milan and encouraged education, scholarship, and art. He lured Vincenzo Foppa from Brescia to develop a school of painting. Threatened by the intrigues of Venice, Naples, and France, he held them all at bay by winning the decisive support and firm friendship of Cosimo de' Medici. He disarmed Naples by wedding his daughter Ippolita to Ferdinand's son Alfonso. He checkmated the Duke of Orleans by signing an alliance with Louis XI of France. Some nobles continued to seek his death and his power, but the success of his government disordered their plans, and he lived to die in peace, the traditional death of generals, in 1466. Born to the purple, his son Galeazzo Maria Sforza never knew the discipline of poverty and struggle. He gave himself up to pleasure, luxury, and pomp, seduced with special relish the wives of his friends, and punished opposition with a cruelty that seemed to have descended to him deviously and mysteriously through the kindly Bianca from the hot Visconti blood. The people of Milan, inured to absolute rule, offered no resistance to his despotism, but private vengeance punished what public terror brooked. Girolamo Olgiato grieved over a sister seduced and then discarded by the Duke. Giovanni Lampugnani thought himself despoiled of property by the same lord. Together with Carlo Visconti, they had been trained by Niccolo Monteno in Roman history and ideals, including tyrannicide from Brutus to Brutus. After imploring the help of the saints, the three youths entered the church of St. Stephen, where Galeazzo was worshipping, and stabbed him to death in 1476. Lampugnani and Visconti were killed on the spot. Olgiati was tortured till almost every bone in his body was broken or torn from its socket. He was then flayed alive, but to his last breath he refused to repent, called upon pagan heroes and Christian saints to approve his deed, and died with a classic and Renaissance phrase on his lips: Mors acerba, fama perpetua. Death is bitter, but fame is everlasting. Galeazzo left his throne to a 7-year-old boy, Gian Galeazzo Sforza. For 3 chaotic years, Guelph and Ghibelline factions competed in force and fraud to capture the regency. The victor was one of the most colorful and complex personalities in all the crowded gallery of the Renaissance. Ludovico Sforza was the 4th of Francesco Sforza's sons. His father gave him the cognomen Mauro. His contemporaries jokingly transformed this into Il Moro, the Moor, because of his dark hair and eyes. He himself good-humoredly accepted the nickname, and Moorish emblems and costumes became popular at his court. Other wits found in the name a synonym for the mulberry tree, in Italian, Moro. This, too, became a symbol for him, made the mulberry color fashionable in Milan, and provided a theme and motive for some of Leonardo's decorations in the Castello rooms. Lodovico's chief teacher was the scholar Filelfo, who gave him a rich grounding in the classics. But his mother Bianca warned the humanist that we have princes to educate, not merely scholars, and she saw to it that her sons should also be skilled in the arts of government and war. Lodovico was seldom physically brave, but in him the intelligence of the Visconti freed itself from their cruelty, and with all his faults and sins he became one of the most civilized men in history. He was not handsome. Like most great men, he was spared this distracting handicap. His face was too full, his nose too long and curved, his chin too ample, his lips too firmly closed. And yet in the profile attributed to Boltraffio, in the busts in Lyons and the Louvre, there is a quiet strength in the features, a sensitive intelligence, an almost soft refinement. He earned the reputation of being the craftiest diplomat of his time, sometimes vacillating, often devious, not always scrupulous, occasionally unfaithful. These were the common faults of Renaissance diplomacy. Perhaps they are the hard necessities of all diplomacy. Nevertheless, few Renaissance princes equaled him in mercy and generosity. Cruelty was against his grain, and countless men and women enjoyed his beneficence. Mild and courteous, sensually susceptible to every beauty and every art, imaginative and emotional, and yet rarely losing perspective or his temper, skeptical and superstitious, the master of millions and the slave of his astrologer, all this was Lodovico, the unstable, culminating heir of clashing strains. For 13 years, from 1481 to 1494, he governed Milan as regent for his nephew. Gian Galeazzo Sforza was a timid, retiring spirit, dreading the responsibilities of rule. He was subject to frequent illnesses and incapable of serious affairs. Incapacissimo, Guicciardini called him. He gave himself to amusement or idleness, and gladly left the administration of the state to the uncle whom he admired with envy and trusted with doubt. Ludovico resigned to him all the pomp and splendor of the ducal title and office. It was John who sat on the throne, received homage, and lived in regal luxury. But his wife, Isabella of Aragon, resented Ludovico's retention of power, urged John to take the reins of office in his own hands, and begged her father, Alfonso, heir to the throne of Naples, to come with his army and give her the powers of an actual ruler. Ludovico governed efficiently. Around his summer cottage at Vigevano, he developed a vast experimental farm and cattle breeding station. Experiments were made there in cultivating rice, the vine, and the mulberry tree. The dairies made butter and cheese of such excellence as even Italy had never known before. The fields and hills pastured 28,000 oxen, cows, buffaloes, sheep, and goats. The spacious stables sheltered the stallions and mares that bred the finest horses in Europe. Meanwhile, in Milan, the silk industry employed 20,000 workers and captured many foreign markets from Florence. Ironmongers, goldsmiths, wood-carvers, enamelers, potters, mosaicists, glass painters, perfumers, embroiderers, tapestry weavers, and makers of musical instruments contributed to the busy din of Milanese industry, adorned the palaces and personages of the court with ornaments, and exported sufficient surplus to pay for the softer luxuries that came from the East. To ease the traffic of men and goods and give the people more light and air, Ludovico had the principal streets widened. The avenues leading to the Castello were lined with palaces and gardens for the aristocracy, and the great cathedral, which now took its definitive form, rose as a rival focus of the city's throbbing life. Milan had in 1492 a population of some 128,000 souls. It prospered under Ludovico as not even under John Galeazzo Visconti, but complaints were heard that the profits of this flourishing economy went rather to strengthen the regent and glorify his court than to raise the populace from its immemorial poverty. Householders groaned at the heavy taxes, and riots of protest disturbed Cremona and Lodi. Ludovico answered that he needed the money to build new hospitals and care for the sick, to support the universities of Pavia and Milan, to finance experiments in agriculture, breeding, and industry, and to impress with the art and lavish magnificence of his court ambassadors whose governments respected only those states that were rich and strong. Milan was not convinced, but it seemed to share Ludovico's happiness when he brought to it as his bride the tenderest and most lovable of the Ferrara princesses, this in 1491. He made no pretense that he could match the vivacious virginity of Beatrice d'Este. He was already 39 and had served a number of mistresses who had given him 2 sons and a daughter, the gentle Bianca, whom he loved as his father had loved the passionate lady from whom she took her name. Beatrice raised no difficulties about these usual preparations of the Renaissance male for monogamy, but when she reached Milan she was shocked to find her lord's latest mistress, the beautiful Cecilia Gallerani, still lodged in a Castello suite. Worse yet, Ludovico continued to visit Cecilia for 2 months after his marriage. He explained to the Ferrarese ambassador that he had not the heart to send away the cultured poetess who had so graciously entertained his body and soul. Beatrice threatened to return to Ferrara. Ludovico yielded and persuaded Count Bergamini to marry Cecilia. Beatrice was a girl of 14 when she came to Ludovico. She was not especially pretty. Her charm lay in the innocent gaiety with which she approached and appropriated life. She had grown up at Naples and learned its joyous ways. She had left it before it could spoil her guilelessness, but it had imparted to her a carefree extravagance which now, in the lap of Ludovico's wealth, so indulged itself that Milan called her amantissima del lusso, madly in love with luxury. Everybody forgave her, for she diffused such innocent merriment, spending day and night, reports a contemporary chronicler, in singing and dancing and all manner of delights, that the whole court caught her spirit, and joy was unconfined. The grave Ludovico, some months after their marriage, fell in love with her, and confessed for a while that all power and wisdom were negligible things beside his new felicity. Under his care she added graces of mind to the lure of her youthful esprit. She learned to make Latin speeches, dizzied her head with affairs of state, and at times served her lord well as an irresistible ambassadress. Her letters to her still more famous sister, Isabella d'Este, are fragrant flowers in the Machiavellian jungle of Renaissance strife. With playful Beatrice to lead the dance and hard-working Ludovico to pay the bills, the court of Milan now became the most splendid, not only in Italy but in all Europe. The Castello Sforzesco expanded to its fullest glory, with its majestic central tower, its endless maze of luxurious rooms, its inlaid floors, its stained-glass windows, its embroidered cushions and Persian carpets, its tapestries, telling again the legends of Troy and Rome. Here a ceiling by Leonardo, there a statue by Cristoforo Solari or Cristoforo Romano, and almost everywhere some luscious relic of Greek or Roman or Italian art. In that resplendent setting, scholars mingled with warriors, poets with philosophers, artists with generals, and all with women whose natural charms were enhanced by every refinement of cosmetics, jewelry, and dress. The men, even the soldiers, were carefully coiffured and richly garbed. Orchestras played a combination of musical instruments, and song filled the halls. While Florence trembled before Savonarola and burned the vanities of love and art, music and loose morals reigned in Lodovico's capital. Husbands connived at their wives' amours in exchange for their own excursions. Masked balls were frequent, and 1,000 gay costumes covered a multitude of sins. Men and women danced and sang as if poverty were not stalking the city walls, as if France were not planning to invade Italy, as if Naples were not plotting the ruin of Milan. Bernardino Corio, who came from his native Como to this court, described it with classic flourishes in his lively Historia di Milano, from circa 1500. The court of our princes was splendid exceedingly, full of new fashions, dresses, and delights. Nevertheless, at this time virtue was so much lauded on every side that Minerva had set up great rivalry with Venus, and each sought to make her school the most brilliant. To that of Cupid came the most beautiful youths. Fathers yielded to it their daughters, husbands their wives, brothers their sisters, and so thoughtlessly did they thus flock to the amorous hall that it was reckoned a stupendous thing by those who had understanding. Minerva, she too, sought with all her might to adorn her gentle academy. Wherefore that glorious and most illustrious Prince Ludovico Sforza had called into his pay, as far as from the uttermost parts of Europe, men most excellent in knowledge and art. Here was the learning of Greece, here Latin verse and prose flourished resplendently, here were the poetic muses, hither the masters of the sculptor's art and those foremost in painting had gathered from distant countries, and here songs and sweet sounds of every kind and such dulcet harmonies were heard that they seemed to have descended from heaven itself upon this excelling court. Perhaps it was Beatrice who, in the fervor of maternal love, brought disaster to Ludovico and Italy. In 1493 she bore him a son, who was named Maximilian after his godfather, the heir apparent to the imperial throne. Beatrice wondered what her future and the boy's would be should Ludovico die, for her lord had no legal right to rule Milan. John Galeazzo Sforza, with Neapolitan aid, might at any moment depose, exile, or kill him. And if John should manage to have a son, the duchy would presumably descend to that son, regardless of Ludovico's fate. Ludovico, sympathizing with these worries, sent a secret embassy to King Maximilian, offering him his niece, Bianca Maria Sforza, in marriage, with a tempting dowry of 400,000 ducats, or $5 million, provided that Maximilian, on becoming emperor, would confer upon Ludovico the title and powers of Duke of Milan. Maximilian agreed. We should add that the emperors who had given the ducal title to the ruling Visconti had refused to sanction its assumption by the Sforzas. Legally, Milan was still subject to imperial authority. John Galeazzo was too busy with his dogs and doctors to bother his head with these developments, but his fuming Isabella sensed their trend and renewed her pleas to her father. In January 1494, Alfonso became king of Naples and adopted a policy frankly hostile to the regent of Milan. Pope Alexander VI was not only allied with Naples, he was anxious to unite the town of Forli, then ruled by a Sforza, with other cities in a powerful papal state. Lorenzo de' Medici, who had been friendly to Ludovico, had died in 1492. Driven to desperate measures to protect himself, Ludovico allied Milan with France, and consented to give Charles VIII and the French army an unhindered passage through northwestern Italy when Charles should undertake to assert his rights to the Neapolitan throne. So the French came. Ludovico played host to Charles and bade him Godspeed on his expedition against Naples. While the French marched south, John Galeazzo Sforza died of a combination of ailments. Ludovico was wrongly suspected of poisoning him, but gave some support to the rumor by the haste with which he had himself invested with the ducal title, this in 1495. Meanwhile, Louis, Duke of Orleans, invaded Italy with a second French army and announced that he would take Milan as his rightful possession through his descent from John Galeazzo Visconti. Ludovico saw now that he had made a tragic error in welcoming Charles. Swiftly reversing his policy, he helped to form, with Venice, Spain, Alexander VI, and Maximilian, a holy league to expel the French from the peninsula. Charles hastily retraced his steps, suffered an indecisive defeat at Fornovo in 1495, and barely managed to bring his battered army back to France. Louis of Orleans decided to wait for a better day. Ludovico prided himself on the apparent success of his tortuous policy. He had taught Alfonso a lesson, had foiled Orleans, and had led the League to victory. His position now seemed safe. He relaxed the vigilance of his diplomacy and again enjoyed the splendor of his court and the liberties of his youth. When Beatrice became pregnant a second time, he freed her from marital obligations and formed a liaison with Lucrezia Crivelli, this in 1496. Beatrice bore his infidelity with impatient grief. She no longer spread song and merriment about her, but immersed herself in her two sons. Ludovico vacillated between his mistress and his wife, pleading that he loved both. In 1497, Beatrice was a third time confined in childbirth. She was delivered of a stillborn son, and half an hour later, after great agony, she died, aged 22. From that moment, everything changed in the city and the Duke. The people, says a contemporary, showed such grief as had never been known before in Milan. The court put on mourning. Lucrezia Crivelli fled into obscurity. Ludovico, overcome with remorse and sorrow, passed days in solitude and prayer. And the strong man who had hardly thought of religion now asked for only one boon, that he might die, see Beatrice again, earn her forgiveness, and regain her love. For 2 weeks he refused to receive officials, his envoys, or his children. He attended 3 masses daily, and daily visited the tomb of his wife in the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie. He commissioned Cristoforo Solari to carve a recumbent effigy of Beatrice, and as he wished, when dead, to be buried with her in one tomb, he asked that his own effigy should be placed beside hers. It was so done, and that simple monument in the Certosa di Pavia still commemorates the brief, bright day that for Ludovico and Milan, as well as for Beatrice and Leonardo, had now come to an end. The tragedy ripened rapidly. In 1498, the Duke of Orleans became Louis XII of France, and at once reaffirmed his intention of taking Milan. Ludovico sought allies, but found none. Venice bluntly reminded him of his invitation to Charles VIII. He gave command of his army to Galeazzo di San Severino, who was too handsome for a general. Galeazzo fled at sight of the enemy, and the French marched unhindered upon Milan. Ludovico appointed his trusted friend Bernardino da Corte to guard the well-fortified castello, and bade him hold it till Ludovico could secure aid from Maximilian. Then Ludovico, in disguise and through 100 vicissitudes, made his way, on September 2, 1499, to Innsbruck and Maximilian. When John Trivulzio, a Milanese general whom Ludovico had offended, led the French into Milan, Bernardino surrendered the castello and its treasures to him without resistance, for a bribe of 150,000 ducats, or $1,875,000. Since Judas, mourned Ludovico, there was no greater treason, and all Italy agreed with him. Louis bade Trivulzio make the conquered pay for the conquest. The general levied heavy taxes. The French soldiers behaved with coarse insolence. The people began to pray for Ludovico's return. He came with a small force of Swiss, German, and Italian mercenaries. The French troops retired into the castello, and Ludovico entered Milan in triumph on February 5, 1500. During his brief stay there, a distinguished French prisoner was brought to him, the Chevalier Bayard, renowned for courage and courtesy. Ludovico restored to him his sword and horse, freed him, and sent him back under escort to the French camp. The French did not return the courtesy. The garrison in the castello bombarded the streets of Milan, until Ludovico, to protect or appease the population, changed his headquarters to Pavia. His funds began to run out, and he fell behind in paying his troops. They proposed to compensate themselves by pillaging the Italian towns, and fumed when he forbade them. He engaged Gianfrancesco Gonzaga, husband of Beatrice's sister Isabella, to lead his little army. Francesco agreed, but secretly negotiated with the French. When the French appeared at Novara, Ludovico led his motley force to battle. It turned at the first shock and fled. Its leaders arranged terms with the French, and when Ludovico tried to escape in disguise, his Swiss mercenaries betrayed him to the enemy on April 10, 1500. He accepted his fate quietly, merely asking that his copy of the Divine Comedy should be brought to him from his library in Pavia. White-haired, but still proud, he was led through hostile, mocking crowds in the streets of Lyons, and was imprisoned in the castle of Lis Saint-Georges in Berry. Louis XII refused to see him and ignored the pleas of the Emperor Maximilian to set the broken captive free, but he allowed Ludovico to stroll in the castle grounds, to fish in the moat, and to receive friends. When Ludovico fell seriously ill, Louis sent him his own doctor, Maître Salomon, and brought one of Ludovico's dwarfs from Milan to amuse him. In 1504 he transferred Ludovico to the chateau of Loches and allowed him still wider liberty. In 1508 Ludovico tried to escape. He made his way out of the castle precincts in a load of straw. He lost himself in the woods, was tracked by bloodhounds, and thereafter suffered a stricter imprisonment. He was deprived of books and writing materials, and was confined in a subterranean dungeon. There, on May 17, 1508, in a dark solitude, all the world away from the bright life of his once gay capital, Ludovico, aged 57, died. He had sinned against man and woman and Italy, but he had loved beauty, and had cherished the men who brought art and music, poetry and learning to Milan. Said one of Italy's greatest historians, Girolamo Tiraboschi, a century ago, "If we consider the immense number of learned men who flocked to his court from all parts of Italy and the certainty of receiving great honors and rich rewards, if we recall how many famous architects and painters he invited to Milan, and how many noble buildings he raised, how he built and endowed the magnificent University of Pavia and opened schools of every kind of science in Milan, if besides all this we read the splendid eulogies and dedicatory epistles addressed to him by scholars of every nationality, we feel inclined to pronounce him the best prince that ever lived." 6. Letters. Ludovico and Beatrice gathered about them many poets, but life was too pleasant at this court to inspire in a poet the arduous and persevering devotion that produces a masterpiece. Serafino of Aquila was short and ugly, but his lyrics, sung by himself to the lute he played, were a delight to Beatrice and her friends. When she died, he slipped away from Milan, unable to bear the heavy silence of rooms that had rung with her laughter and known the lightness of her feet. Ludovico invited the Tuscan poets Camelli and Bellincione to his court in the hope that they would refine the rude diction of Lombardy. The result was a war of Tuscan versus Lombard poets, in which venomous sonnets ousted honest poetry. Bellincione was so quarrelsome that when he died, a rival wrote an inscription for his tomb, warning the passer-by to tread quietly, lest the corpse should rise and bite him. Therefore Ludovico made a Lombard, Gasparo Visconti, his court poet. In 1496 Visconti presented to Beatrice 143 sonnets and other poems written in letters of silver and gold on ivory vellum, illuminated with delicate miniatures, and bound in silver-gilt boards enameled with flowers. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.